Good evening all, and welcome. In tonight's episode, we're going to be heading into the woods for some truly horrifying experiences. So grab your flashlights and let the darkness take control. The Hester House was a legend passed down from class to class in my high school over the decades. Students and even teachers told a variation of the story about a house that belonged to one of the earliest families in our community in central Pennsylvania, then burnt down a century earlier, but reappears with the first full moon in October. The story was based on a real house that belonged to a family which owned much of the land in the country, but sold it off for residential and commercial development over the decades. When the house burned down in the 1950s, it took with it the last of the Hester family line. The problem was that no one knew where the house had been. There were some old foundations along the southern slopes of Peters Mountain, but none of them could be linked, historically, to such a house. The only history was that of the suburban legend, which evolved over the years. The one thing that remains constant was the promise of a treasure hidden under the floorboards in the house. If you found the house while it existed in our realm, you might find cash, gold, and jewels, enough to make you rich, of course. But if you didn't get out the house before it vanished, you would vanish along with it, and be destined to haunt its walls forever. Of course, this was the excuse used by high school kids over the years to go into the woods up on Peters Mountain to camp or have bonfires, or really, to try and find the house. In the 1980s, it was still a time when parents didn't mind their kids being gone overnight, and none of us had cell phones. Overnight games of Dungeons & Dragons were common on weekends, and my gaming group were led by a kid who lived at the base of Peters Mountain. He and his brothers loved the story of Hester's house, and as October approached that one year, he took a break to persuade us to leave our tabletop adventure and go on a real one. We were a group of 6 boys aged 16 to 17, and it was easy for us to tell our parents we were staying over at Cliff's house for a marathon weekend of D&D. Instead, we gathered camping material and agreed to head up the mountain to a small campsite Cliff knew, and the full moon rose over the mountain as we searched for the Hester house. Of the 6 of us, we lost the 16-year-old for lack of permission. We lost 2 more who chickened out, so there were 3 of us who remained that had to split the gear, which put us behind schedule for the camp. The woods were damp, and leaves were already falling across the trail, making the shallow uphill slippery and the steeper climbs treacherous. Getting up in the daylight was going to be fine, but after dark, there would be 2 miles between camp and Cliff's home, and another 3 miles back to town, so we were committed. We reached the clearing where Cliff and his brothers and a lot of Hester's house seekers made camp. It was a relatively flat area with a view down to the mountain in the trees, but we were totally insulated by trees and cut off from the world by the sound of the forest, with only the regular whistle of a distant train to cut through it. By the time we reached this camp, we had lost a half hour and scrambled to assemble dry firewood, start a fire, and get the tent pitched. The wind rose out from the west and cut through the trees, making our activities difficult. From there, things started to fall apart. There were poles missing from the tent bag. We could only find a limited supply of dry firewood to get the camp started. The wind freshened, and darkness swept over us as the sun set behind the mountaintop, and clouds approached from that direction. The temperature plummeted from the mid-50s while we worked up a sweat to the low 40s with a chilling breeze. Cliff and I struggled to improvise solutions for the tent, using branches to pop up walls and tying others to trees with nylon rope. Meanwhile, Keith fumbled and stumbled trying to get the fire lit, resorting to lighting an entire box of matches under the kindling in a gamble to get the fire lit and hot enough to dry out the moist firewood. We knew that any significant rain was going to put it out, and we would be huddled together in our sleeping bags under a sagging tent all night. We abandoned the idea of searching for Hester's house and prepared to weather a storm. Once we established some kind of camp, the rain held off for a while, just bringing a cold drizzle. We took turns maintaining the fire and threw shade at one and another for not checking the equipment or planning the weather, and generally being miserable. As the light faded, we heard movement in the woods around us, definitely human footfalls through the leaves and underbrush. It cut through the sound of dried leaves, rustling and falling from the whistling wind through the trees and the updraft that blustered up the side of the mountain. Suddenly, a big object landed right in the middle of the campfire, throwing hot embers and burning twigs in every direction, including our tents. The evening brightened in a dance of fireflies over the fire, and we stepped out to find out what happened. Did a limb fall? Was it a wet branch popping with boiling water pockets? It was a rock the size of a basketball. Cliff pointed out to the dark figure standing on the trees on the far side of the fire. It was a tall, husky figure, standing slightly hunched like he was getting ready to charge or run away. Movement through the woods resumed, and we detected 3 other people about 50 feet up and down the mountain around the campsite. The first figure we saw stood motionless for moments. Cliff yelled, more ticked off than afraid, "Who are you guys? Don't mess with the fire." The first figure started laughing. It wasn't another kid. It was older, raspy, and that was joined by other older-sounding voices in laughter. A softball-sized rock struck a tree trunk over my head and bounced off to one side. Another sailed over Keith's head and struck the tent, snapping the branch holding up one side. We scattered. I don't know what the others were thinking, but I wanted to keep trees between me and as many of them as I could. The laughter intensified, and more rocks landed in the campsite. I slipped in the wet leaves and slid down towards one of the men as he rushed forward towards me, arms out. He was wide and slow, juggling as he advanced and laughing like it was the funniest thing he'd done all year. He slipped and face planted in the muddy ground. By that time I had traction and was heading back up the slope towards camp. I took a small rock to the shoulder but glanced off my padded shoulder, and I kept moving. I got to the camp, and one of the men was standing in front of the fire, his features in the shadow. He pointed at me and roared, "Leave Hester's house alone." He then took a couple of burning logs and tossed them into the tent. He ran off, chased by the others in the same general direction. Cliff and Keith rushed back. The tent was a loss. We had to smother it, and it began to rain. A wall of rain rushed in from the west, and it poured so hard that it poured out the fires and left us in darkness. We huddled together to be able to talk over the rain. Are they gone? Where'd they go? What do we do? We had flashlights, and while cold and soaked, we were uninjured. We gotta get out of here. We heard footsteps in the darkness, and a single beam of light shot out from the forest over us. The voice from before screamed, "Leave the Hester house alone. Get out of here, or we will end you." We abandoned our gear except our flashlights, and Keith led us away from the site down the mountain. We were moving at half the speed coming up. It was sloppy and slippery, and the rain was relentless. We slid on our butts over the steep parts and had to stop to work out a way down that wouldn't risk breaking our legs or necks. Every time we stopped, a rock would sail down between us and snap against other rocks or a tree, and a voice would shriek, "Go, or we'll bury you on this mountain. I want the skinny one. She's cute." A rock hit Keith on the cheek and nearly sent him over an incline, but he dropped to his knees to keep from rolling. It dazed him, but his adrenaline kept him moving as the skin swelled and darkened. I said the first thing I thought of to Cliff. "If these guys are your brothers and they're friends, I will be so pissed." But Cliff shook his head. Not them. They'd never do this. And I believed him. But most of the town, dating back a generation or more, did know about Hester's house story and the date. It would be easy for someone with bad intentions to come out into the woods on the first full moon and wait for a bunch of stupid, unprepared kids to make camp far from wilderness. Suddenly, the stories about kids going missing inside the Hester house trying to get treasure made me think if anyone actually did go missing on a dark night in the woods and the house was just a cover-up story. A rock hit me between the shoulder blade with the power of a fastball, and I felt something pop in my spine and a sharp shock up and down my entire body. After what felt like hours in the increasing darkness, dry heaving from the panic and the struggle, coughing and spitting up snot and rainwater, we came to the road closest to Cliff's house. There was a man standing under the streetlight by the street. He had the same predatory hunch as the man at the campsite. Soon 3 or 4 other figures appeared and blocked our path. We stopped and they began moving towards us. Suddenly our silent prayers were answered when a truck rolled around the corner heading up the hill and bathed them in its headlights, blinding them. These were not kids nor young adults. They were older men, faces in their 50s or 60s, bloated and wrinkled, covered in dirty clothes and windbreakers. They were ugly, evil-looking men who had worn us down to exhaustion and were ready to strike. The truck did not slow down, but it gave us a break. Cliff pulled us onto one side of the path and back into the woods, along a similar, natural path along the road. With a supernatural reserve of strength, we cut through the barbs and brushes like rabbits eluding wolves, and came out scratched and scraped across the street from Cliff's house. The porch light was lit, and the garage door was wide open. Cliff's dad was working on something in the garage. We heard the men chasing us along the road, but once they saw the lights of the house, they stopped. We didn't stop until we were in the garage, yelling to Cliff's dad that there were bad men after us. Cliff's dad called the cops. Cliff's mum took us inside, dried us off, and helped tend our injuries. The cops never found anyone, but they scolded us for being irresponsible enough to go camping in the woods without supervision or preparation. The sergeant there saved his strongest words for Cliff's parents, effectively ending our weekend D&D games. Prevailing wisdom was that it was probably some older guys who lived on the mountain who just wanted to scare some kids out on Hester's house night, and they dismissed our dramatic interpretation of the peril, which was, in their mind, the product of our excitement and hormones. The newspapers took a decidedly Halloween approach to the story, spinning it as a tantalizing tale of transients stalking local kids on a camping trip with God knows what in mind when they caught us. But weird Hester's house guardians in the woods, it's been 30 years, but if I'm ever in the neighborhood again, I hope we never meet, because I'll straight up end you. My family has a camping timeshare, and we used to go camping for weeks at a time in the summer. My dad had to work, so he could stay at home Monday through Thursday and come meet us at the campgrounds Friday to Sunday. The campgrounds had a pool, miniature golf course, basketball courts, and we'd gone for so long that my mum was comfortable letting us wander since there was only one entrance and exit. When I was around 8, but was small for my age and looked around 5, I met a boy who was camping with his single dad for a few days. He came to our campsite a lot and knew we were staying for a while. I was pretty sad when he left, but his dad said they'd come back sometime soon. A few weeks later, his dad came to the campsite right after my mum left to take a shower. He told me his son was coming later that week. He asked where my parents were, and I told him my dad doesn't come until Friday, and that my mum always takes showers at this time. He said bye and left. The next day, he came by at the same time and told me that he had just found some kittens and asked if I wanted one. I said yes. He told me he kept them in his tent and that I could come and pick one. Now this guy wasn't a stranger. My mum had met him when he picked up his son from our campsite, so I didn't get that creepy stranger vibe and get okay going with him. We walked towards his campsite, but then he told me he had actually moved them to his truck so they wouldn't get hot, which made sense to me. He pointed to his truck right outside the gates of the entrance. I started to walk towards the entrance with the guy when my dad pulls up. He got the day off work so that he could spend more time with us. He asks what's going on, and I say, Tommy's dad says he has kittens in his truck and I can have one. My dad gets out the car and tells me to run back to the campsite, so I do. When my dad gets back to me, he tells me to never go alone with an adult anywhere, even if I know them. I asked my mum for years later, and the whole thing she told me was that my dad kicked the crap out of him and called the cops. My fiancé and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about half-hour away from where we live. For reference, my fiancé is black. We live in a predominantly white, conservative and racist area. These details are important for later. On our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside us to the right was occupied, but the one to the left was not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the exact same plot the year before. Needless to say, we were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in the woods. The first night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. Now, back to the main event. On August 11th, we spent the day at the battlefields a town over with my family. They had all been invited to join us for the day by my fiancé as a surprise for me while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family into the evening at about 6 p.m. before heading back to our campsite. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been in our tent. Our blankets were thrown around, clothes were on the floor, and my backpack had been rearranged and I was missing underwear. But hey, we were stupid 19-year-olds, and decided that since whoever had busted in had left and hadn't taken anything important, it would be fine and they would not return. So we set up our campfire and sat out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores and smoking cigarettes and celebrating our engagement. At around 9:30 p.m, we put our fire out and decided to go into our tent for the night to celebrate a little more. Nothing too loud or obnoxious. Immediately after we were finished, we started to hear the noises outside of our tent again, but this time we were focused in. We clearly heard footsteps, and at one point a man whispering. We looked at each other and our eyes got wide. Someone was definitely walking around outside our tent. We were still completely silent, just listening to the footsteps, and we heard whispering again. Crap, that makes 2 men walking around our tent. As if we had the ability to read minds, my fiancé said, I have to go to the bathroom, and I agreed. The bathroom was up the hill from our site. Most people who were in lower sites like ours drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now here's the part where I still get chills thinking about it. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and his keys and stepped out of the tent. He pulled me with him and we ran like hell to the car. I heard the footsteps running behind us and then turning and running up another campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We spoke about sleeping in the car and driving into the town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to our campsite and began packing everything up in the car. At this point, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us thought possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed in 5 minutes and hopped in the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the drive and grabbed our nameplate, which had my full name on it, off the post. As we pulled out the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time, stalking through the woods onto our campsite. They were 2 tall white men. I realized that these were the same men who had been driving past our campsites the whole time we were there, just glaring at us and muttering to each other. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other was wearing a Confederate flag tank top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and ready. They then turned when they saw our car driving away, and one started to make chase until the others stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo. and he smiled, the most terrifying evil smile at me, and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest and hardest to follow roads, and called my dad, so he would know we were coming. When we got home, we told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off as us being paranoid, so I never told anyone else besides all of you now. I am convinced to this day that this was going to be a racially motivated attack. The campgrounds were not heavily populated, and my fiancée was the only non-white person at any of the campsites. It was no accident that the two men who had been shadowing us since our arrival and wore Confederate flags and had one on their truck dedicated to target the interracial couple. I still get cold chills when I think about how close we were to being killed or seriously hurt that night, and how lucky we were that our reckless plan to just make a run for it worked. So to those men who stalked our campsite with hunting knives, let's not meet again. I was 18 at the time. One evening, me and my two friends, Mike and Paul, decided to go camping. Well, camping might not be the right word for it, since we didn't intend to spend the night. Mostly just to chill and have some fun around the campfire for a while. The plan was simple. Head out, build a campfire, drink a few bottles of wine, eat something and head back home for a good night's sleep. We met at my house when it was still sunny outside. We got ready and we headed out. Our destination, an old abandoned quarry in the middle of the woods, which was maybe 40 minutes away from my house. Even though the quarry has a tragic and frankly creepy history, it is a popular place for such occasions. When we got there, the sky was already colored red, as the sun slowly sank behind the hills. We quickly gathered all the firewood that we could, so we wouldn't have to look for it later. As the darkness fell and absorbed all of our surroundings into impenetrable blackness, we already managed to get the fire going. We were in a great mood, and we were already getting ready for our first toast. That's when we realized that we made a horrible mistake. We forgot the corkscrew. We were trying to open the bottle of wine without it, but we quickly gave up, because the bottles were quite expensive, and we didn't want to damage them. At this point, it was clear that one of us would have to sacrifice himself, jog back to retrieve the corkscrew. After a bit of haggling, I volunteered. However, I had two conditions. Firstly, they would give me a hatchet in case something went wrong along the way, and secondly, no pranks when I got back. Mike and Paul agreed without hesitation, shoved a hatchet into one hand and a flashlight into the other, and sent me on my merry way. As I was jogging through the forest, I heard a noise resembling a wild boar. Suddenly I remembered a warning I received from a few old hunters some days ago. One said that around this time of year boars were getting dangerous, especially at night. I was a bit nervous, but luckily managed to survive with no harm. I arrived safely to my house, much to the surprise of my mum, who didn't expect me so early. I explained the whole ordeal and she just laughed. I grabbed the corkscrew and was back on my way. Not wanting to experience an unpleasant boar encounter, I chose another slightly longer path, this time through an open field. After a while, I got to our spot. It was a small clearing surrounded on one side by massive rocks, maybe 70 meters tall, and on the other side by thick forest. Somewhere in the middle of the clearing was our campfire. When I approached it, I realized there wasn't anyone, although our backpacks were still on the ground and the fire was burning bright. Great. We specifically agreed that there would be no pranks when I got back. Those dicks thought that they were funny, I thought to myself. I resigned to sit down near the fire facing the woods. The only place where those two jokers could have hidden, I thought. I was really tired, and all I could think about was the taste of that exquisite Pinot Noir we brought with us. I really wasn't in the mood for their games, and was getting quite angry. That's when I heard a snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves from the edge of the forest, maybe 30 meters from where I was sitting. The sound was rhythmical, and it was undoubtedly the sound of someone walking. I aimed my flashlight to the spot where the sound was coming from. In between the trees, I spotted a tall person wearing a dark hoodie. As I shined my flashlight on him, he stopped walking, turned to me and just kept staring motionlessly. Even though he was directly facing me, I couldn't really see his face, and shouted, "Paul, you fatso, I know you're trying to scare me. We agreed on something, so stop messing around and come out." As I finished, the hooded figure just turned around and walked deeper into the woods. Exactly at that time, my phone started ringing. Hastily, I took it out of my pocket. It was Mike. I took the call and started barking at him. "Real funny. I thought we agreed on something." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking to you about you trying to mess with me. I clearly saw you, so you can come out now." Mike, as if frozen for a minute, or for what felt like an eternity. All I could hear was heavy breathing and Paul mumbling something in the background. When he finally snapped back to reality, he just said, "Dude, we're at your house. We heard some footsteps and we just thought you were trying to mess with us, but then we got scared and decided to look after you. I forgot the phone at your house, so we couldn't even call you. Just get the hell out of there and we'll come back for our stuff." "Bullcrap. That's just another one of your funny pranks and I'm not buying it." "Hold on a second." For a while, all I could hear was some incoherent mumblings. "Hey, what's going on?" asked the voice of my mum coming on the phone. My head suddenly spun and my heart skipped a beat as I realized they weren't kidding. Suddenly, a freezing wave of fear ran through my body. However, I managed to convince my mum that everything was just fine and that she need not worry. She gave the phone back to Mike. "Just leave everything and come back. We're heading out now. We'll meet you halfway there." "I'm not going anywhere alone again. You guys better get your asses here and do it quick. I'm waiting for you, but..." And then I hung up. I didn't want to make any more noise than I already did. I quickly turned off my flashlight and started to walk back from the fire. I moved all the way to the huge wall of rocks and figured that if I had my back covered by the rocks, I would eliminate one of the possible ways the unwanted visitor could approach me. I was standing there in complete darkness, trying to not make a sound while tightly clutching my hatchet, which would be my best friend for the next half hour. I had to constantly convince myself not to curl into a ball in fear. Even my own body started to betray me. As my hearing got worse due to my savagely beating heart, I was trying to calm myself, but then again, in worst case scenario, every bit of adrenaline would help. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted 2 weak light beams coming from the forest. I heard Paul shout my name, and I have never been so relieved. I finally ran out of my hiding spot to greet my 2 friends. For quite some time we were just standing there laughing like maniacs from relief. We were even getting a bit cocky, and we thought about staying. After all, it was just supposedly one creep lurking between the trees, and there were 3 of us. Funny. Just minutes earlier I was crapping myself with fear, and now I was suddenly full of tough, macho nonsense thinking, what could possibly happen? In the end, healthy judgment got the better of us and we decided to go. We packed our things, put the fire out, took our bottles of wine to enjoy elsewhere. Somewhere nice and brightly lit. My friend Sally had a bad run with neighbors, but this one was by far the worst. Sally lives very close to me, about a 10-minute walk away. We were both around 14 years old when this happened. We live rural, so we both have a lot of land. Me and Sally decided to go camping on hers. We bought cheap hammocks and went through the bushland. The days prior we spent clearing some of the razor grass with a cane knife to make a path. We probably should have worn long pants because we ended up with little cuts all over our legs and our arms. We set up our hammocks and brought quite a few blankets out there because it got pretty cold at night, even though you're sweating throughout the day. We were still on her property and hadn't gone onto her neighbor's boundary. Her neighbor had just leased the land to new tenants. Me and Sally were sitting on our hammocks talking and laughing at around 9 p.m. when we heard something in the bush. We thought it was just a wallaby. There's plenty of wallabies around there. Then we see the figure of a man. We were whispering to each other trying to see who it was. At first we thought it was her brother. He came to scare us when we were camping previously. Then as the person got closer, we were thinking it could have been her dad. It was dark, and the bush looked the same from every angle. That's when we realized the man was coming in the other direction of her house. We didn't dare move and covered our torches and hid under our blankets. The man came up and said hi, and introduced himself as Ben. Now Ben was extremely drunk, staggered around and reeked of alcohol. He started saying how he had a nice little camp here and said something pretty unsettling. "I'll have to come out here and sunbathe naked here on one of these hammocks." Sally and I gave each other worried looks but didn't say anything. It only got worse from there. I can't remember everything he said because it was a while ago, but he was mumbling for what felt like forever. But some of the things stuck out. "I'll have to kill you Wolf Creek style," and said, "You're nearly legal then?" when he asked our ages. Ben was probably in his 40s. Me and Sally were texting each other while he was talking and coming up with an escape plan. He also offered us a puff on the Magic Dragon and pulled out a glass pipe. We respectfully declined. Sally said that we were leaving back to the house to make food. He told us to come back. We left our blankets and most of the stuff there and just legged it. Told her dad what happened and slept inside. The next morning we went back to our campsite to find everything burnt. A circle with about a 20-meter radius was all burnt. Coming from that circle was a line of burnt grass going towards the neighbor's house. I'm not a firefighter, nor do I do forensics, but it seems obvious that some kind of fuel was used. Me and Sally were talking, and it dawned on us the possibility that Ben may have thought that we were in the hammocks due to the pile of blankets. Ben was definitely drunk enough to not be able to tell the difference. We went and told Sally's dad, who then checked it out and went next door. Ben's roommate answered the door and said Ben wasn't home and apologized, and even gave Sally's dad $50 for the blankets and hammocks. Nothing more happened for the next few months. Sally told me at school how Ben had been caught on camera sneaking around her yard. I went to her house after school because she was going to be home alone until her dad finished work. I ended up sleeping there for the night. That's when he came over. Ben was drunk and came out to the front of Sally's house and started yelling. He accused Sally of stealing his dog. Sally's dad called the police. They arrested him, and the next day we found a knife in the yard. It wasn't from Sally's house. The police came again and we told them about the knife, and they got the footage from the camera as well. I don't know what happened to Ben, but he no longer lives next to Sally. I joined my school's camping trip to Malaysia when I was 14. I no longer remember where it was, but it was pretty close to Penang. I loved camping, and this trip was pretty unique. The campsite was aimed to provide authentic experiences in Malaysia. I know it's touristy surroundings, but it gave an interesting premise. Instead of camping on land near the beach, the campsite was on stilts about 500 to 800 meters away from the shoreline. It recreated those floating villages around Southeast Asia. There was a small hut, showers and bunk beds over the ocean blue. The toilets were just outhouses that emptied into the salty brine below. You could even see your business float away. Incredibly gross but memorable. 100 teenage girls were going to sleep there for a week to experience village life, aka climbing coconut trees and flying traditional Malay, which are kites. Midway through the stay, my camp leader had allowed my group to use our sleeping bags to sleep on the wooden square. We were lulled to sleep by the slow, gentle waves. The wooden boards floated over the high tides, warping and sinking with our collective weight. A night full of stars. The sea breeze was cool and fresh. A few girls woke up to use the toilet. We had to go in groups of 3 wherever we went. I rolled in my sleeping bag and watched the shoreline. When I saw something floating on the waves, it was triangular and shrouded in black. I was too groggy to care, so I went along with the girls to use the outhouse. In the outhouse, something felt off. I felt watched in that cramped space. It didn't make sense. I looked down into the ocean below and stood still. The dim light of the outhouse shined to something floating below me. A line was attached to a shadowy figure. The end of the rope was attached to a metallic object stuck on the floorboards at the edge of the hole. I nearly tripped on it while I walked in, and I thought it was a nail. The figure held onto the rope and was yanking it gently against the push of the waves. I realized the figure was floating on the triangular thing I saw earlier. My mind clicked with an eerie thought. It was a person, a real breathing person, on a man-made raft holding onto a rope with a hook, and I was blocking his way in. The shadowy figure looked at me from down below, the whites of his eyes looking into mine. I couldn't scream. I felt the rush of blood in my ears. The man smiled up at me, as if he wanted me to complete the show. I backed out of the outhouse and walked back to my group. The two girls with me didn't notice me shivering. The camp leader picked up on my shaking hands and asked me to step aside. I told him what I saw. The camp leader nodded silently. Like a big brother, he sternly told my group to enter our bunks quickly and silently. My group never caught on to what happened. They noticed my pale face, but I brushed it off to seasickness, sleeping on the top bunk. I saw torchlights running around the perimeter of the campsite. The official story to the increased activity that night was one of the outhouse's floorboards broke, and the camp leaders were trying to assess the damage. We completed the camp and went home. On the bus back home, my mind raced about that night. How long was the man watching us? My group was on the main platform for a good hour and a half. He could have been scouting areas to climb in. If he was waiting to climb through the outhouse for his moment, did he watch the girls use it too? Gross. You could clearly see the ocean below. He would have had a clear view too, and it still gives me chills whenever I think about it. When I was 5, I went camping with my dad and stepmom in the Angeles National Forest. We drove further out than the official campsite, but not too much further. Right off the dirt road, there was a really large clearing. You could tell other people camped there sometimes, by the fire spot in the center, far from the trees. So after some hiking and roasting hot dogs by our fire, we went to sleep pretty late. My dad had an old Toyota with a camper on it, so him and my stepmom laid in the camper, and I laid across the front bench seat. There was a little sliding window inside the truck between me and where they were laying, and the truck was all locked, so it felt safe, except that window was shut because my dad snores. I fell asleep, and sometime later was awoken by the sound of someone tapping on the truck door window. My head was by the driver's side window, and the tapping was at the passenger window by my feet. The sound immediately scared me, and I didn't open my eyes. I knew it couldn't be my dad, because he would have just knocked on that inside window, or opened it, if he needed to tell me something. The tapping kept up, about 7 taps at a time. Then they would just wait a few seconds and do it again. It sounded like they were tapping just loud enough to wake me, but not my dad. I considered the possibility of a tree branch touching the window, but remembered how far away the trees were. I could still hear my dad lightly snoring from the camper. Sometimes the tapping sounded like a short fingernail. Sometimes it sounded like the padded fingertip. I was scared to death. I could hear my heart pounding and my mind was racing. Suddenly the tapping started on the driver's side window right above my head. I almost jumped out my skin and twitched all over. My face had to have shown my fear and shown that I was not sleeping. I was too scared to scream or call my dad. I felt like I had to lay as still as possible and try to fake like I was asleep. Not the smartest idea, but I was only 5. It also didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a human finger, tapping then pausing. It happened for maybe an excruciating 3 minutes, and then the last 2 sets of tapping were the loudest, and then it stopped. I still kept my eyes shut the whole time, terrified of what I might see, until I fell asleep at some point. In the morning I looked around at how far the truck was from the trees and everything else, I knew it couldn't have been any of that. I told my dad and stepmom about it. She seemed kind of uninterested, but my dad seemed really perplexed and concerned, and was very glad that the truck was locked. So whoever kept tapping on the window at night, let's not meet. The scariest moment of my life happened while my friend and I were camping in eastern Canada as teenagers. We decided to sleep in this abandoned camper we found deep in a large forest that was near our town. It had been there so long that small trees had grown around it. We'd stumbled across it when we were exploring a few months back and thought it would be cool and brave to sleep there for a night. So one weekend we did. We arrived after dark because we had gotten lost trying to find the camper. We had a really low power flashlight, so it made it even more difficult. Once we finally found it, we opened the rusty door and stepped in. The sounds inside the camper were shrill and echoey. There were your typical camper things strewn about: cups, empty cans, swollen pulp fiction novels. Already tired, we holed up in one end of the camper where the bed area had originally been, before the cushions had rotted away to almost nothing. A long hallway stretched the length of the camper, so we could basically see from end to end. It was a miserable night. There were several rats living in there, and I saw them staring at us from a chewed-out part of the ceiling. When the wind blew outside the camper, it would shriek and groan. We even thought we could hear a bear outside too, walking around. Still, we feigned bravery and acted like we were having a good time, but we were on edge. At some point, I woke up from an uncomfortable sleep. I sat up to adjust myself when I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye. At the other end of the camper there was a small window, and as I looked at it, I saw a man's silhouette. He was clearly staring straight at me from outside. At first I thought maybe it was just a weird shape of a tree or something, but when I moved a bit to get a better look, the person clearly reacted and then froze. My heart was pumping, and I woke up to get my friend immediately saying there's someone over there, and, in a whisper, not taking my eyes off his profile. He woke up immediately and I nodded towards the window. He saw him too. He whispered frantically about who it could be and why he was staring at us, and for the next 10 minutes, no joke, we stared him down. The longer we stared at him, the more frightened we got. He would occasionally move, but always kept his eyes locked on us. Eventually I shouted at him, but got no reaction. My friend was braver than me and decided to shine the flashlight at him, and as soon as he did, we realized our horrible mistake. It wasn't a window at all on the other side of the camper. It was a mirror. We had been staring down ourselves from the very start. Completely idiotic. Still, it was the most fearful, relieving and funny moment of my life that I'll never forget. Closest to the paranormal I've ever been. Last August, my husband and I decided to go camping for a few days to celebrate our anniversary. We live in Oregon and prefer to dry camp. If you don't know what that is, essentially it's just going out into the woods, finding a secluded area, and setting up camp. We do this specifically to be away from people. This trip, we decided to go somewhere new. We drove across the river into Washington and ended up in Cougar at Merrill Lake. There were a few campgrounds near the lake that weren't too packed, but like I said before, we prefer to be secluded, so we kept driving far past the campground, several miles into the woods. My husband was driving, while I was scouting for a spot that looked promising enough for us to pull over and check out. After driving for over 20 minutes, we decided to pull over into a random spot that was flat enough and allowed us to drive our vehicle slightly off the road. We got out of the car and began scouting the area. It didn't look too promising at first, but we walked down a small hill and found a perfect spot to set up camp. It was a short enough walk that we could move our camping gear from the car, and far enough from the road that we were tucked away and not visible to passers-by. Keep in mind that our car was still visible from the road, so passers-by could obviously tell that there were other people around. Our first night was great, no weirdness. The second day and night, I can't say the same. Around noonish on our second day, we were sitting around the fire pit, which was still slightly lit from breakfast, when all of a sudden we hear footsteps approaching our campsite. We thought this was a little strange considering we were in the middle of a huge empty forest, and they had literally miles upon miles of forest to choose from. Maybe I'm just antisocial, but I go out into the forest to get away from humans, not to find them. We wait to see who's approaching us, and it's two men, probably in their mid to late 20s. They start approaching our site, and my husband acknowledges them and says hello. They say hi to us, but one of the guys made sure to lift his shirt up, revealing a pistol, and had his hand resting on his gun for the entire conversation. They eventually made their way past us, and for whatever reason decided to set up camp probably 30 to 40 yards behind us. At this point I started feeling weird about them, and told my husband that the whole situation seemed really weird. He agreed, but we didn't want to let it ruin our trip, so we spent the rest of the day at the lake, away from the camp. Fast forward to bedtime. Obviously, my husband and I were both having trouble falling asleep. At this point in our lives, we didn't own a gun yet. All that we had was a hatchet and a Bowie knife to defend ourselves, if need be. We started watching Planet Earth episodes that we had downloaded from Netflix, hoping we could just fall asleep watching. I was drifting in and out of sleep, and at around 10:30 to 11 p.m. I hear footsteps pacing around our campsite. I at first told myself it was an animal, but couldn't figure out what kind. The footsteps seemed heavy, and they seemed to be in two places at once. For example, I would hear shuffling over by the campfire, then I would hear footsteps that seemed to be walking around the tent. I was scared and frozen. My husband is perked up at this point, listening with me. This goes on for almost an hour before I eventually just fell asleep, trying to be as quiet as possible. My husband said he stayed up for another hour or so, but the sounds eventually stopped and he fell asleep. I still have no idea who or what was hanging out at our campsite for so long, or why these dudes decided to camp so close to us in the middle of an empty forest. But we bought a gun pretty quickly after this relaxing weekend away. I am 24 years old, non-binary, but female presenting, and my sister 22, female. Been camping this week at a lake and came home today a day earlier. Her friend, another 22-year-old female, came up to hang out the first day and went home since she had to do work. Since it's been 90 to 100 degrees the past month, we spent most of our day in our swimsuits swimming and kayaking in the lake. You know, like any normal person when camping in a lake. Sure, we were showing some skin, but literally everything that needed to be covered was. The camp hosts are a married couple, probably in their late 50s. The husband drove by, checked that we were the ones with the reservation, and drove off in his golf cart. A little while, my sister and her friend went to the bathrooms in their swimsuits, right after the husband had refilled the toilet paper. According to them, he stared at them the entire time, creeping them out, but they just went back to the water. Later that evening, the wife gave me our passes and we chatted for a bit, and she seemed normal enough. The next day, however, she started talking about how her husband was talking about us. Apparently, he told her to check out the hot girls in Site 8 and that he appreciated our womanly attributes, aka our chests and butts. He even laughed and said he's married but not dead yet. After all, she looked at my sister and then me and asked, "So you guys are leaving on Wednesday, right?" in a tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and my gut screamed run. I confirmed, and she left. That evening they spent a lot of time with the campers next to us, the husband finding the perfect spot to sit and stare at my sister on the hammock. I immediately grabbed a camping chair and sat so that I blocked his view. He stayed there for well over an hour and just kept staring at us. We texted our parents when we got cell service to let them know we were heading home a day earlier than planned. We wrote everything down and planned to file a complaint with the state forestry. Lucky today went off without any issues and we're home safe and sound. Just royally creeped out and pissed off. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. Camping is certainly creepy. I haven't done it in so long. I think the last time I did it, if I remember correctly, must have been about 2005, roundabouts. So not 15 years, 15 years and 15 and a half years, went with school. Long time ago. Doesn't even feel like long ago, but it really was. In any case, I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. Please do let me know if you did, and if you didn't, you can also do that. Huge thanks to my wonderful members and patrons whose names are on screen for your continued support. It really does mean the world to me. Alright then guys, I think I am going to leave the episode here. Stay safe everyone, and awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.